The dust of Redemption Creek tasted like forgotten promises. It settled on the sweat-slicked hats of silent men and the bonnets of women who stared at their own feet, a fine grit of complicity. In the center of the town square, on a crude wooden platform that usually held a preacher or a politician, stood 3 children. They were not children of the town. Their skin was the color of rich earth, their hair as black as a starless night, and their eyes held a stillness that was older than the cracked earth beneath them. They were Comanche, orphans of a war no one here had fought but everyone had profited from. The auctioneer, a man named Bartholomew with a face like curdled milk, cleared his throat. His voice was a greasy thing, sliding over the quiet crowd. He wasn't selling cattle or land. He was selling lives, indentured servitude until the age of 21. A lifetime, for children who looked no older than 10, 7, and 5. The oldest, a boy, stood ramrod straight, his small hands clenched into fists. He protected the 2 younger girls with his body, a tiny, defiant wall against a world of giants. No one wanted them. They were a reminder of the blood that had soaked the plains to make way for towns like this. They were seen as wild things, liabilities. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. And into that silence, a new sound appeared, the tired, rhythmic clop of a single horse pulling a dusty mail wagon. On its seat, clutching a small, worn valise, was Ilara. She had come for a new life, a new name, a husband she knew only from a single, stiffly written letter. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, took in the scene on the platform, and the hope she had nurtured for 1,000 miles withered and died. She saw not savages, but children. She saw the terror they tried so hard to hide behind stoic faces. The auctioneer, growing impatient, tried to sweeten the pot. He spoke of strong backs for field work, small hands for mending. The crowd shifted, but no one spoke. The price was too high, not in dollars, but in conscience. A voice, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, cut through the heat. $10. All eyes turned. Judge Silas Kane stood on the steps of the courthouse, his hand resting on a silver-headed cane. He was the law in Redemption Creek, and his law was twisted to the shape of his own greed. His smile was a thin, cruel line, a wound on his face that never healed. He didn't look at the children as human beings, he looked at them as assets, tools to be used and discarded. The auctioneer's face lit up with relief. Judge Kane bids $10. A generous offer for these unclaimed souls. He looked around, a challenge in his eyes. Do I hear 11? The silence that answered was heavier this time, thick with fear. No one crossed the judge. His silver mine on the edge of town was as much a graveyard as it was a business. Men went in, profits came out. The equation was simple and brutal. Ilara felt a tremor start in her hands, a feeling she hadn't felt since she buried her parents back east and used the last of their money to answer an ad for a mail-order bride. It was the tremor of righteous fury. Her intended, a man named Thomas, had promised a home, a place to belong. But this place, this town that would sell children from a stage, felt like no home she could ever stomach. She clutched her valise, the few dollars meant to start her new life nestled inside. It was nothing. It was everything. Before she could think, before she could let fear strangle the words in her throat, she called out, her voice clearer and stronger than she ever imagined it could be. $15. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads snapped in her direction, mouths agape. Judge Kane's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, reptilian curiosity. He turned his full attention to the woman on the mail wagon, a stranger, a nobody. He saw her simple dress, the exhaustion on her face, the defiant tilt of her chin. His eyes narrowed. And who, might I ask, are you? Ilara slid down from the wagon, her legs unsteady but her resolve hardening like steel in a forge. She walked toward the platform, the crowd parting before her as if she were a ghost. My name is Ilara, she said, her voice not breaking. And I bid $15. The judge's laugh was a dry, rasping sound, like stones grinding together. It held no humor, only contempt. He descended the courthouse steps, his cane tapping a menacing rhythm on the wooden planks. He circled Ilara slowly, like a wolf sizing up a lamb that had foolishly wandered from the flock. Ilara, he mused, tasting the name. You have no standing here. You are no 1 inch. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried across the silent square. I know who you are. You're the mail-order bride. For Thomas Miller he paused, letting the name hang in the air. A pity you traveled all this way. There was an accident at the mine. Thomas won't be needing a wife. A flicker of something that might have been triumph flashed in his eyes, a darkness that confirmed every fear crystallizing in Ilara's heart. He owned the mine. He owned the town. And he had owned Thomas Miller's life. The implication was a physical blow. Ilara staggered, her hope not just dead, but desecrated. She was alone, penniless, a stranger in a town run by a monster, her one connection to this place buried in the man's unholy ground. The judge smiled, seeing her despair. His contract for your passage now belongs to me, he said smoothly. In a way, you belong to me. That was the twist of the knife. He believed he had all the power. But as he spoke, the oldest child on the platform, the boy, did something unexpected. He had been watching Ilara, his dark eyes missing nothing. He leaned toward his sister and whispered a single word in his own tongue. A name. But Ilara heard it. So Hanoi. It was a strange, sharp sound, but it snagged in her memory. In his letter, Thomas had mentioned his work, his fears. He'd mentioned his foreman, a cruel man the other miners feared. An Apache name he'd picked up somewhere. So Hanoi. The foreman at the judge's silver mine. The connection was instant, a bolt of lightning that illuminated the whole horrific picture. This wasn't random. The children weren't just found. Their past, her future, and Thomas's death were all threads in the same web, and the judge was the spider at its center. The revelation burned away Ilara's fear, leaving behind a core of pure, unyielding resolve. This was no longer just about saving 3 children from a terrible fate, it was about honoring the man she never met, the life she never had. It was about justice. $20, she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. The crowd murmured, a current of shock passing through them. The judge's eyes narrowed to slits. This was no longer amusing, it was an affront. You have no money, he sneered. You have nothing. Ilara opened her worn valise. She pulled out a small cloth purse and emptied its contents into her palm. A few silver dollars and a handful of coins. Her entire worldly wealth. I have $25.63, she announced, her gaze unwavering. I bid it all. The judge was about to laugh, to crush her with a casual bid of 100, 1,000. But Ilara did something that shattered the rules of the auction, the rules of this town, the rules of the world he controlled. She turned from him and looked directly at the children. Her expression softened, the hard edge of defiance melting away into something fierce and protective. I am not bidding for indentured servants, she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the square. They are not property. She took a step closer to the platform, her hand outstretched not to claim, but to offer. They are my children, she said, the words a sacred vow. They will take my name. The name is Vance. Ilara Vance. The auctioneer stared, his mouth hanging open. The judge was frozen, his face a mask of incandescent rage. A woman, a penniless mail-order bride, had not just challenged his bid, she had challenged his entire worldview. She had declared these Comanche outcasts as family. In his world, that was an act of rebellion. It was a declaration of war. What would you do in that moment? With nothing left but your courage, would you stand up to pure evil for the sake of 3 strangers? Let me know in the comments below what you believe true courage is. And if you think Ilara did the right thing, subscribe to this channel, because what she does next will shock you. The judge's fury broke like a dam. This is a farce. She has no right, he roared, his voice bouncing off the silent buildings. Sheriff, arrest this woman for disrupting a legal proceeding. A man with a tarnished star pinned to his vest detached himself from the side of the courthouse. His eyes were dull, his shoulders slumped. He was the judge's man, a puppet who had long forgotten how to pull his own strings. He started forward, his hand moving reluctantly toward the pistol on his hip. The crowd held its breath. Elara stood her ground, her body shielding the children on the stage, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. She had made her stand, and now she would pay the price. But then, another voice entered the fray. It was deep and resonant, like the tolling of a great bell. The lady has made a claim. All eyes turned toward the smithy. Standing in the massive doorway, his leather apron dark with soot and sweat, was Jebediah, the blacksmith. He was a giant of a man, with arms as thick as wagon axles, and a face that was usually grim and silent. He had lived in Redemption Creek for a decade, speaking only when necessary, his forge the only place he seemed to come alive. He wiped his hands on a rag and took a slow, deliberate step into the square. "It's an adoption claim," Jebediah continued, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "A verbal contract of kinship. It's an old law, but it's still on the books. It must be respected. At least until the circuit judge makes his ruling on his next visit." A murmur went through the crowd. Someone was standing with her. Someone was standing against the judge. It was a crack in the wall of fear that had surrounded the town for years. The sheriff hesitated, glancing from Jebediah's immovable form to the judge's purpled face. He was caught. To arrest Elara now would be a direct defiance of a legal point, however obscure, raised by a respected town craftsman. The judge saw it too. He couldn't use brute force here, not in front of everyone. It would unravel the fiction of his legitimacy. He pointed a trembling finger at Elara, his voice a venomous hiss. "This is not over. You will regret this day." With a final, hateful glare, he turned on his heel and stormed back into the courthouse, his power checked, for the first time, not by a gun, but by a woman's courage and a blacksmith's knowledge of the law. The aftermath was a strange, hollow silence. The auctioneer scurried off the platform. The crowd, unsure what to do, slowly dispersed, casting furtive glances at Elara, Jebediah, and the three children who were now, impossibly, hers. Elara felt the adrenaline drain away, leaving her weak and trembling. She had won, but she had won an empty purse, a powerful enemy, and the responsibility for 3 traumatized lives. She slowly climbed the steps to the platform. The 2 younger girls shrank back, but the boy, Little Hawk, stood his ground, his eyes watchful and assessing. He did not see a savior, he saw another white person, another potential source of pain. Elara stopped a few feet away, sinking to her knees to be at their level. She didn't speak. She just waited. The little one, no more than 5, peeked out from behind her brother. Her name was Sparrow. The middle child, a girl of about 7, named Willow, clutched her brother's arm, her face a mask of silent sorrow. Elara's heart ached for them. Jebediah approached, his heavy footfalls soft on the dusty ground. He gestured with his head. "The Miller cabin is just past the edge of town. It's empty. No one will bother you there." It was the place meant for her, for a life that was now a ghost. It felt fitting. With a quiet nod of thanks, Elara stood and gently extended her hand. Not to grab, but to offer. "I will not hurt you," she said softly, her voice carrying no command, only a plea. Little Hawk watched her for a long moment, then gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He took his sister's hands, and together, the 4 of them walked away from the center of town, a strange and fragile new family, heading toward a dilapidated cabin that was either a shelter or a prison. That night, as the children slept fitfully on a bed of straw Elara had gathered, she stared out the cabin's single dirty window. The place was barely more than a shed, but it was theirs. Jebediah had come by as promised, leaving a sack of flour, a side of bacon, and a newly sharpened axe on the porch without a word. It was an act of solidarity that felt like a lifeline. The beginning was hard. The children were like wild creatures, flinching at every sudden movement, speaking only to each other in their own tongue. Elara did not push. She worked. She cleaned the cabin, patched the roof, and tended to the small, neglected garden out back. She would sing softly to herself, old lullabies from her own childhood, filling the silence not with demands, but with gentle sound. Slowly, a tentative trust began to grow. Willow discovered a small wooden bird Ilara had carved and left on the table. Sparrow started leaving wildflowers on Ilara's pillow. But Little Hawk remained distant, the weight of his responsibility as protector a heavy burden on his small shoulders. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop. He knew men like Judge Kane did not simply forget. Judge Kane was a patient predator. His public humiliation had festered into a cold, calculated obsession. He couldn't seize the children legally with the whole town as a witness and the circuit judge's arrival looming in a few weeks. So he began a campaign of slow, insidious warfare. First, the whispers started. Rumors slithered through town like snakes in tall grass, tales of sickness, of the children being cursed. The few friendly faces that had nodded to Ilara now turned away. The general store owner suddenly found his prices for her were double. The well that supplied water to the Miller cabin was fouled one night, a dead animal dropped into its depths. Ilara was forced to haul water from the creek a mile away, a back-breaking task she performed without complaint. She knew the source of her troubles. She would see the judge's men, the mine foreman Sohanoi among them, watching the cabin from the ridge line, their presence a constant, suffocating threat. The isolation was a vice, squeezing them tighter each day. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, their meager food supply was nearly gone. Desperation was a palpable thing in the small cabin. It was then that Little Hawk finally broke his silence. He came to Ilara as she sat staring into the dying embers of the fire. "He will not stop," the boy said, his voice quiet but clear. "He will kill us to keep us quiet." Ilara looked at him, seeing not a child, but an old soul who had witnessed too much. "Quiet about what?" she asked gently. "What did you see, Little Hawk?" The boy's story tumbled out, a torrent of grief and horror. They had not burned down a barn as the auctioneer had claimed. Their family had lived on a small plot of land in the hills, land that was sacred to their people. Land that, it turned out, held a rich vein of silver. Judge Kane had tried to buy it. Their father had refused. So the judge sent his men, led by the foreman Sohanoi. The children had been hiding, and they watched in silent terror as their parents were murdered in cold blood. The story of the burned barn was a lie to justify seizing the children. The auction was meant to separate them, to send them far away where their testimony could never be heard. They were the only witnesses to the judge's ultimate crime. The storm that had been threatening broke with the fury of a vengeful god. Rain lashed against the small cabin, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves. It was under the cover of this tempest that the judge made his final move. He could not risk them speaking to the circuit judge. He had sent Sohanoi and a half-dozen of his most brutal men to end the problem permanently. Inside the cabin, Ilara heard the first telltale sound, the snap of a twig that wasn't caused by the wind. She grabbed the old hunting rifle Thomas had left leaning against the wall. Her hands were sweating, but her mind was icily clear. She was no longer just a mail-order bride, a victim of circumstance. She was a mother. She would defend her family. She barred the door and pushed the heavy table against it. "Get down," she whispered to the children. Willow and Sparrow huddled in the corner, but Little Hawk came to her side, his face grim. He held a slingshot, its leather pouch filled with smooth, heavy river stones. They were trapped, outnumbered, and outgunned. The first shot splintered the wood of the door, and Ilara flinched but did not scream. She lifted the heavy rifle, rested it in a crack in the wall, and took a deep breath. She had never fired a gun at another living being, but as she saw the dark shapes moving through the rain-swept darkness, she knew she would. Meanwhile, back in town, Jebediah watched the storm from his smithy. He had seen the judge's men ride out, their faces grim, heading in the direction of the Miller cabin. He knew what it meant. For years, he had kept his head down, his grief over losing his own family to cholera making him a spectator in his own life. But Ilara's stand had awakened something in him. He could not stand by and watch the judge extinguish that small flame of hope. He grabbed a heavy hammer from his workbench and walked out into the storm, heading for the stables, then the general store. He was not just a blacksmith anymore, he was a conscience, and he was calling his town to account. The fight for the cabin was a desperate, chaotic ballet of shadows and muzzle flashes. Ilara fired the rifle, the kick of it bruising her shoulder, the sound of it deafening in the small space. She didn't know if she hit anyone, but it drove the attackers back for a moment. They returned fire, bullets tearing through the thin wooden walls. Little Hawk was a whirlwind of motion, darting from window to window, he slingshot a surprisingly effective weapon. A well-aimed stone struck one of the men in the face, causing him to cry out and stumble, his shot going wild. But they were relentless. The front door began to groan under the weight of a heavy log being used as a battering ram. The wood splintered. The end felt terrifyingly close. Just as the door was about to give way, a new sound cut through the storm, a roar of fury from the rear. Jebediah had arrived, and he had not come alone. The stable hand, a young man whose brother had disappeared after an argument with the judge, was with him, wielding a pitchfork like a spear. The store owner's wife, a stern woman who had seen enough of Cain's bullying, carried an old fowling piece. It wasn't an army, but it was a beginning. They fell upon the judge's men from the darkness, a flank attack born of desperation and righteous anger. The hired thugs, caught completely by surprise, were thrown into confusion. In the midst of the chaos, Judge Cain himself emerged from the trees, his fine coat soaked, his face a mask of pure hatred. He had come to watch his problem be solved, and now he would have to solve it himself. He saw Ilara through the splintered doorway and raised his pistol, a clean shot. But he had forgotten about the boy. Little Hawk, seeing the judge's intent, pulled the tripwire he and Ilara had stretched across the doorway earlier. The judge's foot caught, and he pitched forward, his shot blasting harmlessly into the ceiling. Before he could regain his footing, a new group of riders appeared, lanterns held high. It was the sheriff, but his face was pale and he was not in command. Beside him sat a grim-faced man with a federal badge pinned to his coat. The circuit judge, arrived a day early to investigate rumors of corruption that had finally reached his ears. The game was over? Cain looked from the armed townsfolk to the federal lawmen, and the empire of fear he had built collapsed into the mud at his feet. The sun that rose the next morning seemed to burn brighter, washing the town in a clean, hopeful light. The storm had passed, both outside and in. With Judge Cain in federal custody and his foreman Sohanoi confessing to everything to save his own skin, the dark cloud over Redemption Creek had finally lifted. The weeks that followed were a time of rebuilding. Jebediah, the reluctant hero, was talked into becoming the interim mayor, his quiet strength a balm on the town's wounded soul. The story of Ilara and the children became a local legend, a tale of how courage could be as contagious as fear. The Miller cabin was no longer an isolated hovel on the edge of town. A group of men, led by Jebediah, came and repaired the roof, replaced the door, and added a new room. The store owner's wife brought quilts and pots and pans. The community, so long silent and fractured, began to mend itself by mending the lives of the 4 people who had reminded them what it meant to stand for something. Months later, Ilara stood on the porch of what was now undeniably a home. The garden was thriving. Laughter, a sound she once thought she'd never hear, echoed from the yard where the children played. Willow tended to a small patch of wildflowers. Sparrow chased butterflies with a joyous abandon. And Little Hawk, his shoulders no longer burdened, was teaching the stable hand son how to use a slingshot. They were no longer the Comanche Orphans. They were the Vance children. They had started calling her Ina, the word for mother in a language she was slowly beginning to learn. She had come to this town seeking a family and had found one in the most unexpected way, forged not by blood, but in a crucible of injustice and defiance. The moral of this story is etched into the very soul of the West, that true family is not about who you are born to, but who you are willing to fight for. It teaches us that a single voice, armed with nothing but conviction, can rally a silent crowd, and that the greatest acts of redemption begin with a simple choice to protect the innocent. Their story is a testament to the power of a single voice in the darkness. If you were inspired by their journey, subscribe to our channel and become part of our community of story lovers. And don't go anywhere, because the next story we have for you is even more powerful. Click on the video you see on your screen now for another tale you won't forget.